Once upon a time, there were two watchmakers, Hora and Tempus. Both of them were famous for their exquisite work, and as a result, both of them were constantly being interrupted by phone calls from eager customers. These interruptions were so disruptive that they bankrupted Tempus, yet Hora dealt with the same problem, and she flourished. What explains the difference? Herbert Simon wrote this parable in 1962 to help us understand some deep questions. How are complex systems organized? Why do large organizations always seem to have annoying hierarchies? And why is it so difficult to get things done? So let's return to Tempus and Hora. Tempus built fantastically complicated watches of 1,000 parts each, but they needed total attention to keep them together while they were being made. Whenever his phone rang, his work in progress would have to be scrapped. Hora built equally complex watches, and she also used 1,000 parts per watch. But Hora's watches were modular. She could build little components of 10 parts each. If she was interrupted, only the 10-part component would fall apart. And when 10 of those components were ready, she could assemble them into a larger sub-assembly totaling 100 parts. When 10 of those sub-assemblies were ready, she could assemble them into the finished 1,000-part watch. In a world without interruptions, Hora's modular system requires extra work, putting together assemblies of sub-assemblies of subcomponents. But once the interruptions come in, the genius of Hora's system becomes clear, because each interruption only sets her back a few steps. Tempus loses everything every time the phone rings. Hora loses very little. And so Hora is quite literally thousands of times more productive than Tempus, and all because she has a modular system. It says something about the sheer range of Herbert Simon, an economist, a political scientist, a computer scientist, a psychologist, that the first thing he did with this insight was to apply it to evolutionary biology. Complex systems, such as living organisms, needed to be a hierarchy of modular parts. Bodies built out of organs, organs built out of cells, cells built out of polymers, such as proteins, proteins built out of amino acids. But it's also highly relevant to the way organizations work. They, too, tend to be modular, with divisions made up of subdivisions, made up of departments, made up of teams. It isn't sensible for everyone in a large organization to think about every challenge the organization faces. Instead, smaller teams focus on smaller tasks. It's a logical way to get things done. And perhaps the frustrations of life in a big hierarchy, the bureaucracy, the tunnel vision, the office politics, perhaps those things are just unavoidable in a complex world. The parable of Tempus and Hora wasn't really a story about time management, and it was written before email existed. But like any good parable, it suggests some everyday lessons. Keep a to-do list of really small tasks so that you can get going easily after an interruption. Don't check your email too often. And if you're working as a watchmaker, for goodness sake, get a receptionist.